so lovely to have you all here. So we are in the time and space in Deptford, and I am Bianca Saunders. I'm a designer and founder of my brand Saunders, which we are here with all of my pieces. So I really wanted to kind of bring together my world into a store, and I also just have like design as a big part of like my inspiration and what I'm really interested in, as well as like art, architecture, and all those things, and I think they have a nice connection. So I decided to create a talk series with friends of mine. I'll say friends of the brand, but yeah, we actually are friends. And I have so many interesting people that I know, and I feel like the best way of connecting people is getting conversations going. So we are here with Jayden Ali and Ben Broome.
Thank you.
If you guys like to introduce yourself, to say what you do.
My name's Ben. I am an independent curator and writer.
Short and sweet?
Yeah, I like to keep it really short and sweet. We can get into it, but
I'm going to do a big monologue.
Okay.
My name is Jayden Ali. I'm an architect, an artist, a filmmaker, amongst kind of other things. Yeah, I run a studio called J Projects. That's kind of what I keep it short like that. You want more?
we can expand, you know.
Yeah, we could definitely expand. As I was going to say,
all right, thanks for coming, guys.
I was going to say my first question because I was like, the connection I saw you both in is like your practices are quite similar but very stretched apart. So if you could introduce more about what you do.
I suppose I started curating from a sort of social perspective. When I moved to London, I found myself amongst a community of makers, of musicians, of artists, of photographers, of filmmakers, and at the time I was working as a technician in a gallery, installing artworks. So I knew physically how to install an exhibition, and we decided collectively, as a group of friends, to make an exhibition. That's kind of where it all began for me, is this desire to bring people together, to create spaces where art can be shown, where performance can happen, where people can meet, can gather. And I've sort of built on that over the years. I mean, my practice has definitely changed, my ambitions have definitely changed, my taste has definitely changed. But the one thing that has remained constant is a belief in the power of art to bring people together, create reasons for people to gather. And when I say art, that extends to music, to performance, to dance, to poetry, you know, all art forms. And now I really feel like my reason for existence is to create space for these things to happen, physical space, because ultimately we need a roof under which we can gather.
Yeah. Sorry.
No,
I was saying because I guess the difference between you guys is that you create with like found spaces, and then of course Jayden, a lot of the spaces you create might be a bit more institutionalized, or so like how did you end up like kind of finding those, and what's the differences between the two?
I think high and low for me is really important. I love curating shoeboxes and proverbial shoeboxes, apartments, shop spaces, but then I've also worked with galleries, with institutions. curating at a sort of museum scale, and I enjoy both, and I think both is really important. I actually think my best curatorial work has been when there hasn't been a budget and when the spaces have been teeny tiny. I think there's something interesting about restriction that is conducive to good curation, especially with the restriction of scale. If you're working with like found space, if you're working with a minimal budget, you have to be creative about your approach, and I think that's where interesting things can happen. I don't know if you feel the same.
Yeah, maybe just to, it's really interesting to hear you speak about your practice, and maybe just to rewind a little bit in my world, which is, I lead a studio, which is called JA Projects, and the studio's focus is an extension of my own art practice. So in my world, what I'm trying to do is generally make sense of the world around me, and I've been trying to do that since I was a really young child. And where that led me to is a deep interest in the city. Like, I grew up in Bethnal Green, and I'm interested in how I fitted in within the spaces around me, and how the city was manufactured and fabricated and built in such a way where sometimes I belonged and sometimes I didn't belong. So that concern for the kind of, not only the physicality of the city that we live in, but also its more ephemeral elements, like the way in which it's organized, or the way in which it's funded, or like or the way it's controlled, or how security works. That's the extension of the concern of the studio, where we are concerned with how the city works and how we go about challenging the power dynamics that exist within it to bring stories and people from the periphery to the center. So where that's led us is to a similar space, which is a concern for where I think like a big driver of how we can do that is the superpower that we all hold, which is kind of our culture and our inheritance and the way we express ourselves. And so that's led to a concern for the life of cities and the culture that exists in them, and how we mobilize good stories to frame new spaces that are supportive of those cultures, but also spaces that are reflective of those cultures at the same time. So it's a broad brush engagement with all elements of the city, and I suppose that's led us to do a couple of things. I mean, I tried my hand at curating. I've been doing this stuff since I was young as well. I was the co-curator of the British Pavilion in Venice last year. But it also means that in the studio we're doing everything. I was just talking to the gang about producing a film in Uzbekistan. And if you think about peripheral stories locally, you can think about like some of the work that we're doing in institutions like the V&A in East London. We're really trying to express the kind of shared spaces that people feel comfortable with in East London, like markets and high streets and town centres, and to put that, at least an essence of that, in an institution, so that when people step inside of it, they feel at home. And to think about that on a global scale, periphery and centre, like Uzbekistan is not at the centre of kind of global culture, and I think that's a really interesting challenge as well, how we start to kind of shift that dialogue at both scales. So we kind of do, just to your question, for us, we often talk about working in more formal spaces and more informal spaces. So like informal cultural centres are kind of your markets, if you like. It's the stuff that we see, like the wares that people sell. And the formal spaces are museums. And what I'm really interested in is bridging the gap. Like, I think there's magic in the gap between them.
Yeah.
I'm sort of interested in what you were saying about the periphery and the centre, and this like push to to shine a spotlight on the periphery and make the periphery central. But to what extent do you think, to ask you a question, what extent do you think the periphery should stay peripheral? Do you think that there are cases in which bringing it to the centre, you sort of lose an essence of what makes the periphery a great place?
Yeah, I kind of get the essence of the question, and I understand that, and I also think that there needs to be sacred space in which kind of peripheral culture is incubated. But to return to the mission, if you like, the mission is to kind of challenge the power dynamics where people see themselves at the edges. Like until the mission is complete, then we'll keep nudging the dial, because until that happens, then it's about people feeling like they belong. And if you take that with kind of music culture, for example, you can see that. You can say, I grew up in the grime generation, right? So like I grew up in like pirate radios and aerials on buildings, and where we incubated a community that existed in our neighborhood, and we knew who they were, and you could see what happens when that goes kind of like mainstream to the center. But I wouldn't roll that back, because actually what that's done is given people a livelihood, it's given them a profession, it's given them pathways into careers, it's made role models, there are other people that go into it, you have kind of like whole industries and infrastructure around music. So by virtue of moving to the center, I think that's a fine thing. I think there will always be the edges, and I think it's nice to kind of move between the center and the edges.
I suppose like redefine where the edges are.
Yeah, and you have to kind of, as things migrate, there's space for new culture to be incubated as well. It's probably an unending quest that I'm on, but that's an interesting quest for me because it's my practice.
It's interesting that you speak about music as particularly like grime going from the periphery to the centre, because I think music and music culture is a really powerful tool in making these spaces, especially institutional spaces, accessible places. And I think in the last decade we've seen a lot of institutions in London realising the power that music has to bring people into these spaces and to, I suppose, make people feel comfortable. I'm thinking about like Tate Late's. I think V&A also has like a...
I mean, we do a lot of pitching for work. We've pitched for like 3 exhibitions that are about music that will come out next year or something. I think you're onto something, yeah.
So
but you've done that a lot with your beginning exhibitions. I remember when I first met you, there was like a band going in one of them, and like either your friends are DJing and that sort of stuff. So I think that sort of space of integration of music belongs with art, and
I
feel
think so.
the space atmosphere is quite interesting because you talk a bit about that and like what was your reasoning for wanting to do that from the beginning.
I think fundamentally one of my issues with the art world is that it has a tendency to put artists into boxes. I like the sort of grey areas, and I'm interested in artists who centre refusal in their practice, who refuse to sort of conform to these boxes. Within that, there are artists that make music. Within that, there are artists that DJ or have practices that extend beyond their artwork, and I'm interested in those kind of artists, and I'm interested in spotlighting those kind of artists. Many of the artists that I'm lucky enough to work with kind of have these cross art form practices. It's not always the case. I think a good musician is a good musician, and if I think it's a good fit, and if I think they can bring a certain energy, then I might invite them to perform that. an opening or programming around an exhibition because they can draw a certain crowd, because their performance can engage with a new audience. And I think it's those new audiences that I'm interested in going after, trying to create space that is conducive. I spoke about creating space for people to gather. Well, it shouldn't always be the same people.
But with your work, because you've done quite a few different like museums and stuff like that, so when you're thinking about the space, because it's kind of like you're creating the kind of build for then the creator to also build onto that. Is that, how do you find that? Because that's kind of a little bit different, isn't it, in a way that you both work?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you speak about music, right? Because I think on the one hand, there's an affinity to music, and you can see that in a really direct way, like in some things that we produce, music will be a big part, whether it's a film or an exhibition, or even the soundscapes for an exhibition that we design. But in another way, I think it's useful to draw reference from musical motifs, and specifically, I think the DNA of and ideas around call and response are really integral to our work, which is to say, this idea that you will see a music all of the time that exists in kind of gospel, that exists in jazz, that exists in grind, that exists in sound clashing, like in carnival. This idea that you are not in isolation, that you are always in dialogue with something else, and the vocal expression, or at least the simple expression of someone else, and then you are required to respond in such a way. I think that's a really alive place to sit. And so when we get to a space where we're designing exhibitions, I think that is just about like ongoing dialogue and wallowing in the space that is call and response. So curators often provide an object list, and the institution provides the fabric, and we understand who the audience are, and we're trying to listen to kind of what they're all suggesting. Like, what are they trying to say, and what are they calling out for, and how should we respond? So we're in that kind of like, it's not a literal application of music. We're not like, sometimes we go in and we turn the music up and we turn the speakers up and we pump tunes, but sometimes we're just learning from the methodology of expression to produce new work.
I think I'm also interested in the opposite. I think call and response is super important in art to consider viewership, but recently I've been looking a lot at artists that sort of disregard viewership, where the work can, or really was made only with either a very, very specific viewer in mind, or B is like opaque or obtuse in a way to like disrupt conventional sort of modes of viewership. Over the summer I went to an exhibition in Amsterdam at the Rijksmuseum by this artist Stanley Brown, and Stanley Brown, he refused to have any of his work photographed. He refused to be photographed himself. He refused to have any text written about his work. So there's this like mystique that surrounds this artist, because no one really knows what he looks like. They do, but it was his intention that like his own likeness wouldn't be tied to the work. But I went all the way to Amsterdam totally blind, like not knowing anything about this exhibition, not knowing what I was going to see, but only knowing it was happening. And I think curatorially, I'm interested in the call and response and in this dialogue between artwork and viewer, but I'm also interested in kind of twisting this, working with artists who like reject that in totality, and how by showing these opposing attitudes, alongside each other, or not, you can kind of question viewership or allow viewers to question their own position.
Can I maybe just jump in to say, I think I think that stuff is all kind of like super relevant as well, and I think it's good to kind of resist the audience somehow, because then you end up in the echo chamber that we all find ourselves in, giving people what they already consume, and that's not necessarily a healthy place. Like, I'm interested in providing people with an experience that they don't normally get, but when I talk about call and response as a kind of clarification, it's more a question of like what you are tuning into. It's not necessarily just the audience, it's because maybe that's kind of quite binary. Actually, what you hear, if you took the jazz analogy, is you might just hear like the top end of some keys in the distance, or you might hear like the rhythm of like some percussion that's kind of low down. Like, it's what you're in tune to. So I don't know the artist you're speaking about, but like in some ways they're responding to something that they've selected. They're in tune to something in some way.
It's definitely there's definitely a call and response going on, but I suppose it's just like a rejection of that like binary, that like binary idea that the audience and the artist should have some sort of dialogue through the work. I think there is still a call and response, but like the twisting of that is, I guess, what interests me.
But even in that instance, like the audience is kind of being rejected by the work, and that induces some form of kind of response, like it's some form of behaviour or something. So it's an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, if we're looking and we're seeing, and it's presented in these spaces, ultimately, we can form our own opinion.
So you're gonna say something else?
No, I was just gonna, because I guess you guys have spoken about all like the different countries that you've kind of created in spaces in. I don't know if that's even made a difference to exactly how you view things, or is that because in you speaking about kind of changing the perspective around how you've grown up in terms of like London and that sort of stuff, but you've been so international. How do you really know how to place those exhibitions in the right to respond to people in those areas?
I'm just going to say, like, not international enough. Like, we could be like more international.
Oh, okay.
just to set.
That could sound quite random to me. So
just to set. Uzbekistan is quite out there, but it's an amazing place. I think like a lot of your work, like the way in which you go through life, is that you have to kind of find value in different places. And what I find value in, from a personal perspective, is being immersed in new cultures. Like, I love that. I love the feeling of that. I love being dropped in a place. I'm going to go to Japan on Thursday for Christmas. And I was talking today about that because I've never been before. I've never been to East Asia, and just the simple fact that that the written script is not Eurocentric, is not formed from some form of Latin script that you can recognize, is a certain moment where you are disorientated. And I think that disorientation is, and it's something I wanted to say before, that uneasiness is really important. Quite often what I find is, and if go back to that, the mission of the kind of power dynamic is that the power dynamic is entrenched because people feel comfortable in their space. And so there's a moment where I grew up and I've obviously ended up working in spaces where I'm often the only kind of black person in the room, or I'm often the only kind of working class person in the room. And my ambition is to not feel uncomfortable. Like, I feel comfort in the discomfort. And in some ways, I want everybody else to feel uncomfortable so that they can get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because then we know we're on the kind of a level playing field.
Yeah, but how do you do that though?
Good, isn't it? I think it's about I think for us it's about the unexpected, like how, and this is what I was saying about kind of drawing reference. I'll give you an example, right? So we talk through an example. Like, Eloise is in the room, and me and Eloise, we worked together on fashion masculinities at the V&A. which was a retrospective on menswear. It was in 2022, I think. And so the first room that you stepped into was called Undressed, and amazing curator Claire Wilcox. And but the whole premise of this first room was about stripping stuff back to the body. So all of the objects were flesh-colored, and so therefore all of the objects were like cream-colored. And the bodies on display were drawn from the V&A's collection, and they were like Eurocentric casts, sculptures of like Apollo and Hercules. And so when I went into this room, we said, okay, like, what are we going to do to challenge the power dynamic that exists here? How can we supplement the conversation so that there can be a different discussion that takes place? And what we did was work with a photographer where we blew up oversized abstractions of black bodies, with big torsos. And they existed in contrast, so they were these kind of light, fragile, but still inherently like powerful 5-meter high representations of like an overtly black body, framing as a counterpoint to these white bodies that were expressed in this space. For me, I presented this idea and I was like, I remember this moment, I was like, I have no fucking idea whether they're gonna go for this or not. Like, this is institution with a capital I. Like, it's the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's like, its logo's got a crest on it. Like, I don't know what's gonna happen. And then we presented it to the curators, and then they were like, there was this moment of silence, and they turned around and they said, like, it's almost like a contemporary fresco, and it's such a shame that we have to have work on the walls at all. Which was a real vindication, because what we were doing was we were using European motifs. We were speaking in a language in which they understood, but we were challenging the conversation at that moment. And I'm seeking for that. There are like numerous moments like that throughout the practice. I'm looking for those moments all of the time. And it doesn't have to be a challenge in terms of kind of race. It can be a challenge in terms of kind of gender, it can be a challenge in terms of kind of upbringing. Yeah, it's about kind of like understanding what's at play and then offering some form of counterpoint. And in my work, it manifests itself where in something that sits between art practice and something that sits between design.
Yeah, I think every curator has a responsibility to reject this kind of extremely Eurocentric model of curation, which is essentially all most curators know. I mean, the idea of a curator is it comes from the Italian Renaissance, but the idea of how institutions work, the idea of how the contemporary art that is kind of relevant is largely European. Curators are looking at Italy, they're looking at Germany, they're looking at America, but I think there are many different art worlds, and every curator has a responsibility to engage with those art worlds as well, to accept that this like Eurocentric approach isn't always relevant or appropriate or that it should just be challenged. So I speak as a white curator, but I think I feel a responsibility to definitely engage with different modes of art making, like beyond Europe and America, or that mindset to making art.
So I guess before you guys enter a space that's not based in London or across the world and stuff like that, do you spend ample amount of time getting to know the community? I know you, Ben, really well, and of course we met this year as well too. But getting to know people so you're able to actually understand what needs to be created in areas. Like, what's the challenge in that?
I think collaboration is of hyper importance. There are certain spaces that I wouldn't curate an exhibition, like, because of my own identity.
That way.
I wouldn't go.
I have no fucking idea whether they're going to go for this or not. Like, this is institution with a capital I. Like, it's the Victoria and Albert Museum, it's like, its logo's got a crest on it, like, I don't know what's gonna happen. And then we presented it to the curators, and then they were like, there was this moment of silence, and they turned around and they said, like, it's almost like a contemporary fresco, and it's such a shame that we have to have work on the walls at all. Which was a real vindication, because what we were doing was, we were using European motifs, we were speaking in the language in which they understood, but we were challenging the conversation at that moment. And I'm seeking for that. There are like numerous moments like that throughout the practice. I'm looking for those moments all of the time. And it doesn't have to be a challenge in terms of kind of race. It can be a challenge in terms of kind of gender. It can be a challenge in terms of kind of upbringing. Yeah, it's about kind of like understanding what's at play and then offering some form of counterpoint. And in my work, it manifests itself where in something that sits between art practice and something that sits between design.
Yeah, I think every curator has a responsibility to reject this kind of extremely Eurocentric model of curation, which is essentially all most curators know. I mean, the idea of a curator is it comes from the Italian Renaissance, but the idea of how institutions work, the idea of how the contemporary art that is kind of relevant is largely European. Curators are looking at Italy, they're looking at Germany, they're looking at America, but I think there are many different art worlds, and every curator has a responsibility to engage with those art worlds as well, to accept that this like Eurocentric approach isn't always relevant or appropriate or that it should just be challenged. So I speak as a white curator, but I think I feel a responsibility to definitely engage with different modes of art making, but beyond Europe and America, or that mindset to making art.
So I guess before you guys enter a space that's not based in London or across the world and stuff like that, do you spend ample amount of time getting to know the community? I know you, Ben, really well, and of course we met this year as well too. But getting to know people so you're able to actually understand what needs to be created in areas, like what's the challenge in that?
I think collaboration is of hyper importance. There are certain spaces that I wouldn't curate an exhibition because of my own identity. I would make sure that if I was in those spaces, that I was like essentially taking a backseat, and that perhaps my role is more in bringing resources, in finding space, in finding money, and in that sense more facilitating than putting my curatorial stamp on something.
Have you found that as well, or not really?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely. I mean, I think when a project comes around, that it's important to consider it in the deepest way possible. Like, I feel really lucky that over the past 4 years, myself or those in the studio, we haven't necessarily had to deal with projects that are just for money. Like, there's always a fine line between kind of challenge and complicity. Like, where does that line sit in the example that I gave you of the V&A? That's a really difficult thing, like, I know what it is to be complicit in that space that allows them to do their thing. You'll know that too, in certain spaces. But I think the challenge is important, so I think it's definitely like worth thinking about in the initial instance. And so, if it is a project in which we feel like we can make a difference, and the composition of the team has the capacity to make a difference. So in your instance, it would be your kind of local curator. We've done similar things, you know. For instance, we were doing a pitch which was about South Asia, and I'm not South Asian, but I do know many South Asians and we do hold many skills. And I felt like actually to pitch for that project, if we could be the kind of facilitator, or if there was some form of knowledge transfer, or if there was some form of discourse that would allow them to end up being in that space subsequent to us leaving, kind of designing out ourselves, then I think that's a kind of a worthwhile project. So I think it does require care, but maybe to your question, I thought it was a really super good question, which is to say, I generally think that authority to intervene is aligned to the amount of time you spend in a place, and the amount of time that you spend in a community. So quite often, we do lots of arts projects, so if I was talking about the formal and the informal, those are the more formal sector. But for instance, we've been doing stuff like, we've been working in Queen's Market, which is in Upton Park in Newham, and our job there was to renovate the market, you know, to kind of give it new power, new light, and to allow these kind of traders of South Asian heritage to have a market stall, which is often the gateway into wider entrepreneurship. But we didn't feel like we had the authority to do that by just sitting in our studio and just drawing. So we decided to set up a market stall, and we set up this market stall that ran for like a number of months. It ran for like half a year. Like, we would know people by name, and there's people in the studio who like have the phone number of the old woman that lives in the block next door that cooks them rice, and you know, she can go and see them and sends them Christmas cards. It's like for me, it speaks to a wider point, which is the projects I do are so long. Often, it's quite nice to have the mix, but architecture projects, like changing bits of the city, are like 3-4 years. That the project can't be the output. The project has to be the process as well. And so we're looking for value, how we deliver value, and how we do all of the mission stuff that we've been talking about during the process, which requires us to be in the place for a long period of time. Of course, once you get a little bit further, it's a bit more tricky to do. But in the Uzbekistan scenario, we partnered with local production agencies, and you know, like most of the production budget was spent in Uzbekistan. You know, so it was maybe a kind of, and that was in dialogue with the commissioners, and that was to make sure that people in Uzbekistan are being able to benefit from the knowledge in which we were kind of imparting and bringing with us.
Yeah, I think you mentioned two words that I thought were very important, like care first of all, and then like facilitating, and I think that's like fundamentally the role of a curator working internationally is like to exercise care, to be aware, and then to act as a facilitator. But I also really feel like I have a responsibility to London. You know, we've like spoken about all these other countries, and I think London also is in a pretty tough. The whole of the UK is in a tough place at the moment. Did you see this report that came out a couple of weeks ago? I forget the organisation that put together the report, but it was essentially saying that the average yearly income for an artist in the UK is like £12,500.
Yeah, so bad.
And then there's like this talent drain that's happening right now, where basically being an artist is untenable here. So people are leaving, and I feel a personal responsibility. I don't know if you do, to London, yes, but also like the UK as a whole, to make or challenge the status quo here and do what I can on a micro scale to make it a little more equitable, to make it a little more easy for artists to exist. And for like good work to shine through.
Well, I guess this is my rounding question. So I guess what is your hope for the future to change that? And have you guys got any projects coming up next to kind of bring it back home to London?
I think change has to happen. Well, it can happen at a micro level and it can happen at a macro level. A micro level is like facilitating things like this, whereby like people can come, like listen to a talk, speak with one another, like hang out on a Tuesday evening, right? By the Thames.
Yeah. Very rare in London.
A macro level is like sort of governmental change, policy making, and I have ambitions at like all of these levels. You know, like you've come over to my house and like eaten my food, and that is something that we can all do at a micro level to sort of bring people together. But I think, yeah, I mean, we need politicians that I suppose also feel a sense of a commitment, a sense of responsibility, who will read a report like that and say, you know, okay, well, what can we do about this? Personally, I'm interested in space, physical space, creating new spaces for people to gather. I've spoken to you about some ambitions for the future, trying to imagine what institutions of the future look like and how, as individuals, we can try and make moves to make those new spaces, putting pressure on essentially the people who keep the keys, be it your local councillor, be it like the government, be it brands or companies, to essentially give up some of those keys, or at least use them to open doors. So I mean, all of my projects at a micro or macro level are conducive in some way to this kind of vision of the future. But I think at either of those scales, you know, it's all important.
And I think it's so good to listen to you talk about that, because there's obviously overlap, and I see why you put us on the same couch. I think everything I've been talking about, we've been doing lots of work, like quasi corporate work, where we've been working like what are our values in the studio, like what's our kind of mission. It's been really lovely work to deal in that space. And as a deep reflection, I think everything I've been talking about today and everything we're obsessed with is about the pursuit of equity. You know, like when we're talking about challenging power dynamics, or I'm talking about people being able to belong in different spaces, it's really in the pursuit of equitable futures. And when I talk about the balance and the work not being done until the balance is done, that's because we want kind of equilibrium in that space. So there are definitely a few projects on the cards. We do such a range of stuff. One is that we're, as I said before, we're designing the V&A East. Like, this is a brand new museum. It will open in Stratford. Should open this year, so I think it's going to be good. We're doing like the gallery fit outs, and like, you know, I think it's going to be a great extension. And I used to hate Westfield, and I love that place, man. Like, you go to Westfield and you sit down for like half an hour, you see everybody. Like, and it's like the whole center's in this space. So I think that's amazing. On the subject of equity, we're actually in the process of just finishing up like 15 new social homes. They're on the Old Kent Road, actually, in a place called Manor Grove, and on the Tustin estate. And they're 15 brand new homes. And it's the type of project that makes me happy when I wake up in the morning, because I'm like, okay, you lived in this housing block that was left to descend into ruin, and someone is going to hand you a key to a brand new 5-bedroom house. Didn't you just win the lottery? Like, isn't that just amazing as a thing? And I know where that's going. So in that respect, that's kind of great as well. We have this other project, which is in another walk of life. I'm like an advocate for the mayor, for Sadiq Khan. And really that's about kind of advocating for the health of cities and the health of London in particular, to your point about Care for London. And we have this project where we are, I can't quite describe it, but like we've basically set up a classroom where the people who are responsible for high streets across London, so from Hackney, to Southwark, to Lewisham, they all come together and we do kind of like professional development, but we do it in the high street, like we do it in the kebab shop and we do it in the church. Like, it's sick, like it's amazing. Like we was in Brixton the other day, like, and we get people from the community to talk to them about how stuff should be done. This idea of like knowledge exchange and kind of like community empowerment and lifelong learning, the theme that runs through all of them is that we're seeking that type of parity. So I mean, we have kind of like, we could always do it more projects, do you know what I mean? But we've still got like 8 or 10 projects in the studio, and they're kind of in that range as well, up to the kind of very, very big, which is how to plan new parts of the city. So there's a part of the city in Old Oak West, which is Park Royal, in West London, where there's a whole new community being developed. And our role on that project is to think about what the cultural institution should be. So like where the youth club should be, like how the high street operates, like where the healthcare centre is, like it's that type of stuff. So I think as I said, I think it's a never-ending pursuit, and I feel really lucky to be in that quest because it doesn't end.
Definitely, and I hope that I connected you guys both to do something amazing for the future of artists and creating spaces. So thank you to Ben and Jayden, please.
Thank you.
And any questions from the audience?
Right, so yeah, I'm from East London, the area that we went to kind of Upton Park, so I grew up there, and I really know the area off by heart. So the work that you've done there, what was the leaving mark that you made once you had finished with the sort of work that you was doing within that market? I know that market quite well.
Yeah, you know Queen's Market well? Yeah. It's twofold. So the thing that I was suggesting before was that if you think of the project as the output, then the output is still coming. So we've delivered it in phases. So sometimes it's kind of like really simple back of house stuff. Like we've designed and built new toilets and new welfare facilities. So the traders can go and like wash their hands and go to the loo and do everything that they needed to do before they have to go outside and put 50p into a public loo. And actually now you've got these kind of these traders that can do that. We've converted 2 market shops in the market, so in the bit that's undercover, to be the market operations in the back of house and the offices, etc. So the market can run. We've changed all the lighting in the market because when you look into it, it looks really drab and dreary. So that's not only about like welcoming visitors, it's about ensuring that people can like sell their wares in the best light. You know, they can have this stuff. And we've changed the public square outside. There's a sheltered accommodation called Hamara Gar. So we changed all the public square. And not only did we kind of like uplift the square in terms of design, but we've put power and water into the ground in the square so that the square can host events in the future. And there are a couple of other things that I'm sure I'm missing. I think there's new kind of power and in other spaces, but we're actually in the process of changing the canopies. So I think that stuff should be completed by spring or summer, and it will have this kind of new gateway entrance, so it becomes more visible. And all of that stuff is to basically, that stuff is to improve trade. So the proof will be in whether trade goes up or not, right? But that's if you consider the project from an output perspective. If you consider the project from a process perspective, up until that moment, this is a project, this market has been under threat. Sorry, you asked me about the market, so
I'm in. You're saying is the market has been under threat.
Yeah.
It's down for quite a long time.
Yeah, the market has been on the threat for a long time, and the market was actually saved by Boris Johnson, can you believe? Which is kind of like mad. Like, the idea that Boris Johnson saved something.
It was a great man.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, was it? Well, yeah. He saved the market, right? And but what that's led to is a community that has always felt like stuff has been done to them rather than stuff being done with them. So there was a really simple thing that we did when we got this commission is we had to do lots of this thing called engagement in co-design, which is basically like being in the space. And as I said, we had this market stall where we walked around, where we stood, we was on site, people could come to us, we were serving them, like, you know, we inverted the power dynamics in that respect. But what we did in the studio is we put together a team, a female-led team of people who could speak Hindi and Gujarati. And it was a really simple switch, because all of a sudden, the engagement figures, the number of people that we could speak to, and by extension the borough could engage with, just skyrocketed. Because up until that time, you had the kind of, most of the time, you had the kind of like white Eurocentric man from Newham down there with his clipboard trying to talk to people, and you're not getting into the root concerns, which is women don't feel safe in that space. And how are you going to know that if you're not able to communicate with them or speak with them on their own terms? So they're very kind of simple things. They're all about kind of like drivers as well. I think maybe just a summarizing point about that project is there's been so much harm has been done over the years that I don't think our project will remedy will heal all of the wounds. But if we can start to kind of like put a plaster on some of them, or they can just kind of be on the right path to recovery, then I think we've done our job. Time will tell.
And I think further to that, this idea of just doing what you can with the resources that you have is like really important. You said that fundamentally you're interested in creating more like equitable spaces, a more equitable city, and I think we all have a responsibility to just like do what we can with the resources that we have. Some people have more resources.
The ambition is to always nudge the dial. I just want to nudge the dial a little bit and leave it in a better place than it was before. Then I'm happy, and I just go somewhere else and nudge the dial again. You know, that we keep doing it. I don't know, does that answer your question? I feel like there might be a subtext to the question or something. I don't know.
Very good.
Yeah, right, thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. I guess my twofold question. Fun one first. What's a time and a space that you've experienced in your personal lives that you wish you could introduce to the curatorial space and to the rest of the world? Other question is, I really liked how, especially at the beginning of the conversation, where you guys were talking about methodologies behind integrating kind of like wider community and their interests and merging it with sort of like highbrow and what is of the people. I found that like an exhibition I went to, which was like, I feel like hit that on the head really well, was the Top Boy exhibition. And seeing the number of just like different subcultures attending one place. And what was so interesting about that was it was about film. And something that we don't usually see particularly in these spaces of like to disrupt is the medium of film or interacting in the film base, which is something that I think pretty much everybody, is interacting with more than ever. So how are you guys, I know you've been talking about doing that for music spaces, which has had its popularity with 180 and other spaces, of like really creating that same effect with Top Boy. What are you guys looking towards for film and using film as a tool to collaborate and to, yeah?
I think film is an immensely important medium in art spaces, certainly, because ultimately we're living in an age where everyone has access to filmmaking equipment. 30 years ago, it was a specialist thing, and now on your iPhone you can make a film, a piece of video art. I think it's important to differentiate between sort of video art and media. I think, like Top Boy as a now Netflix series has like millions and millions and millions of pounds pumped into it, and Drake's backing it. And, it's sort of become it's become a phenomenon. I think where I feel the commitment is in creating space for film and like film-based art that has been made on a budget by people who aren't Hollywood directors, who might not have been to film school, and who through that mode of filmmaking are pushing the dial. When you say like how are you creating space for film, that's how I want to create space for film, is to create space for those alternative modes of filmmaking. Almost setting a precedent in that, as I said, everyone can make film, and if we're platforming the best of what is made in a kind of DIY capacity, hopefully more people will make it. Film's interesting because it's a medium that is like, you can spend £100 million making a film, or you can spend £0 making a film, and that doesn't really apply to a painting. And video artists make work across that spectrum. But yeah, creating opportunities and especially opportunities for video artists to exhibit is something which I'm super motivated to do.
So there are two questions, right? Yeah. So the first one is kind of time and space question. Is we were invited to give this lecture at the Royal Academy in March, and instead of giving a lecture, we had some form of kind of like weird pageant, variety show, art show type thing. It was strange, but it was good. It was somewhat of a lecture. It was somewhat. It was a lecture. It was an opening statement by me, followed by a conversation between me and Alvaro Barrington, who's a really amazing artist. An opening recital by Yomi Sode, who's an amazing kind of poet. There was kind of like amazing artists, Tandy Lorison and Rosario and Udo, who came in and done their own thing in this kind of performance work. So the thing that was amazing for me, in terms of the time and the space, is that everybody from the ends could come. So it was like all my boys from school, like, they didn't know where they were in this thing, but they got it, and it was my family were there, and I felt like that was a really kind of amazing moment. It was the moment that we shared with the practice, like the members of the practice presenting projects. Behind us was this kind of cinematic backdrop. We would sometimes dive into the film, sometimes step out of it. There's an amazing kind of designer, Rahma Rahman, Rahman, fashion designer, incredible, from Bethnal Green, South Asian descent, queer, made these films about him working in the Bangladeshi community in Bethnal Green and their notions of what it was to be home. So I think that was an amazing moment, and I think the moment I would give to people is I feel so lucky that there was at least one moment in my life where my worlds just collided and people could see how I spent my days. Do you know? And it was a kind of a really proud moment. So I think if anyone gets that, do you know what I mean, you will feel great about it, and I kind of wish that for everybody. The thing that you probably get in terms of kind of this oscillation between projects and film is that I think film has kind of so many parallels to the discipline of architecture, in which you're kind of dealing with time and space. It's time-based medium, and it's depictions in space. It's the manipulation of light. It's the telling of stories. It's the kind of unfolding of life. And so, in my practice, my personal art practice, I've always retreated into the world of film when I really wanted to explore an idea. And quite often I'm trying to explore ideas in the abstract. I'm not necessarily trying to, so for example, Eloise is in the room, and Eloise commissioned us to make, me and my partner to make this film for an exhibition that Eloise was putting on in Marseille. We made this film, which is, I have to paraphrase this film, right? But like, yeah. it's basically like, it smashes like a building by Le Corbusier, who's a really kind of famous like modernist architect responsible for all of the kind of council flats and kind of modernist architecture that you see. Exactly. With like Kim Kardashian's 71 questions walking backwards through her house and her idolized kind of like notions of what it is to have home, with like really graphic scenes of giving birth. And I made this with my partner, and it was all kind of had this subtitle of this critique of especially in the space of Marseille, which is kind of the ground zero for modernism. Marseille is a place in which you're so connected to the sea, and there was this whole kind of French Guy Debord and Situationists had this critique of modernism, which was about they saw it as kind of prisons in the sky, and really this was a kind of meditation on a collective meditation between me and my partner Lottie Sama, amazing artist in her own right. Like, what are those kind of conditions? I'm not necessarily trying to come up with the answers right now, but I'm just making a work that's trying to explore what those conditions are. And where we got to in terms of that film was that it's important to be connected to the ground. Like, that's a really important thing. And how that manifests in our work at the moment is these 15 new council blocks, council houses, they're connected by a play street in the middle, and the play street leads into the front garden, so that like your children can like come downstairs and enter the street and play in the street. You know, we're doing a tower block in Stratford, on Stratford High Road actually, and so yeah, I'm gonna just do this one thing, which is like 100% social housing and 100% family units, and it's all about like what is that journey from your door to the street. So I think film can inform works in quite abstract ways as well. So I bring that round and that was.
I think we have to wrap it up just for the time, guys, but we can probably ask some questions after. And then I think Jayden had one last question.
No, that's right, I can
Thank you, everyone.
Do it.
I actually want to say one last thing, because it made me think. So you spoke about like Marseille being this like ground zero for modernism, and the film was intertwined. Yeah, the buildings of Corbusier. I think Corbusier designed that hotel in Marseille. In relation to what we were talking about earlier, like sort of creating these more equitable spaces. I think Europe and the West has a tendency to like rarefy culture in a way that excludes audiences. And I'll give you an example that relates to Corbusier. A couple of months ago, I was in India and I went to Chandigarh, which is the city that Le Corbusier designed in India. And there are all these Corbusier buildings. It's like this like mecca for fans of modernism. And I did like the tour of these buildings. And people were using these buildings, people were living in these buildings, there were office spaces, there were like Corbusier Chandigarh chairs, which was a design masterpiece that like people were sitting on at their desks, and they'd been like reupholstered with like different coloured like plastic yarn, you know, that was really spoke to a utility of design. And I think that is just kind of riffing off what we were saying earlier, that's like a real issue with how certainly like the West gatekeeps and rarefies culture. As soon as it becomes special, as soon as it becomes worthy or of value, it then becomes kind of museumified, and that like it's the attitude is look but don't touch. And I think that's a real problem. I think we should be touching, because touch and utility and use is like a really important part of how you sort of build community, how you connect with one another. So curatorially, I'm interested in kind of breaking these dynamics, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. So can I just get a round of applause for that's where we can find you in your next project.
Oh wow, probably Instagram is the best thing. Jayden Ali, Jayd and Ali. And I think that's probably the best place. Yeah, there'll be loads of stuff, I hope. Let's hope for a good 2025.
Where can you find me? 39 Clifton Crescent is my address. If anyone wants to knock on my door, I'll make you a cup of tea. It's crazy just putting out. You're always welcome, Liz.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.